Okay, so let's dive in. We've got this, well, fascinating stack of material here, and it's all focused on apostleship in the New Testament. Really important stuff.
Absolutely foundational, yeah. But as our sources point out pretty quickly, there's quite a bit of discussion today about what that term really means beyond that first group.
Right. Like, is it about church leadership structures, or is it more about, say, breaking new ground?
Exactly. And so our goal here for this deep dive is to really get into the New Testament texts using this material as our map, basically, to figure out what apostleship seemed to mean then in its original context.
Perfect. So following our sources, let's start with the actual words. What are the key terms we need to know?
Okay, so there are two main Greek nouns. First, you've got apostolos. You can think of it like a sent one.
A messenger, envoy,
Yeah.
that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Messenger, envoy, representative. It pops up about 80 times.
Yeah.
Then there's apostole. That's more the office or state of being an apostleship. We only see that 4 times, though.
Only 4. And the sources also flag pseudoapostoloi right away. False apostles.
Which tells you something immediately, doesn't it? That the idea of apostle wasn't just some tiny closed-off list that everyone agreed on.
Good point.
And then there's the verb apostolo. It means sending, and it's used way more often, like 132 times.
But our material suggests that one's a bit broad for our purposes.
Yeah, I mean, it can mean commissioning someone to represent you, but by the 1st century, it was often just a general word for sending someone anywhere. So the nouns apostolos and apostole, they're much more specific. They help us narrow it down.
Got it. So we're focusing on that state of being specifically commissioned, sent out. And the first group, the most obvious one our material looks at, is the 12.
Absolutely. Jesus himself picks them out from, a larger crowd of disciples. Luke 6 gives us the details.
And that number 12, that wasn't just picked out of a hat, was it?
Oh, definitely not. Our sources really stress the significance there. 12 in Hebrew thinking is about completeness. It directly mirrors the 12 tribes of Israel.
Oh, okay.
Which is why, in Acts 1, after Judas is gone, they're so keen to replace him and get back to 12. It wasn't just about finding a qualified person. The number itself mattered symbolically.
So it's not just who they were, but what that number represented and their role. It's described as unique, foundational.
Yes, very much so. They're presented as this sacred foundation. You see passages like 2 Peter 3.2 or Revelation 18.2 linking prophets and apostles together, like foundation layers for the Old and New Testament eras.
And Revelation 21 even puts their names on the foundation stones of the New Jerusalem.
Exactly. And our material points out that that reference seems very specifically about only this core group of 12. It highlights their unique place.
But they weren't just symbols, right? They were active.
Oh, for sure. Initially, the sources suggest their main focus was spreading the gospel among the Jews. Later tradition, which the material mentions briefly, talks about some going much further. You hear stories about Thomas reaching India, others heading into Turkey, Russia, Ethiopia.
Okay, now what about their authority? That comes up too.
Yeah, they were definitely given broad authority by Christ himself. But the material we have makes an interesting point. It doesn't really see strong evidence that their primary job was setting up a kind of top-down hierarchical church government for everywhere. It uses the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15 as an example. The decision there involved the apostles and the elders and even the whole church. It was more collaborative.
And even that big meeting didn't totally settle the issue it was about, right? The Judaism thing continued.
That's what the source points out, yeah. It suggests their authority wasn't necessarily about centralized, ongoing governance in that way.
Okay, interesting. So that sets the scene for the 12.
Yeah.
But then almost immediately the material pivots to Paul. He seems different.
He really does. He's introduced as the great apostle to the Gentiles. And the sources really underline that he was sent directly by Jesus.
Just like the 12 were.
Yes. But the curious thing, as our material puts it, is that he wasn't one of the original 12. And if you look back at Acts 1, the criteria they set out for replacing Judas, well, Paul doesn't fit.
What were those criteria?
They needed someone who'd been with the disciples right from the start of Jesus' ministry and who had personally witnessed the resurrection in that specific context.
Right, and Paul came later.
Much later. Even with Christ appearing to him, he doesn't meet those Acts 1 specs. And our sources say others later called apostles, like James or Barnabas, wouldn't have either.
So that tells us what?
It strongly signals that another category of apostle beyond the 12 was already recognized in the New Testament church.
Yet Paul definitely saw himself as an apostle with real authority. He writes about it all the time.
Absolutely. He asserted that authority across the Gentile world, and he clearly includes himself in that foundation of the apostles and prophets in Ephesians 2.
So how do the sources square that?
They sort of see him as a bridge figure. He had this broad foundational authority. I mean, look how much of the New Testament he wrote. But they specifically connect his apostleship to his calling to take the gospel to new places, to people who hadn't heard it before, that pioneer aspect.
Which leads us right into that next category, the material explorers, these pioneer gospel workers.
Exactly. The sources explain this group wasn't part of the 12, but they shared that core apostolic calling. Remember the original meaning of apostolos?
Sent one, messenger.
Right. Sent by a higher authority representing them, carrying out a task, often sent abroad with a specific commission.
And the material connects this directly to the big commission in Acts 1.8, doesn't it?
It does. You will be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the ends of the earth. Our sources say this isn't just a nice verse, it's like the roadmap for the whole book of Acts.
Showing the gospel spreading out.
Yeah. And crucially, the material shows that the 12 weren't the only ones fulfilling that mandate. Others were being witnesses in those expanding circles too.
Okay, so who does the material specifically point to as being called apostles in this broader sense?
Well, there's several key examples. First up, Barnabas and Paul. In Acts 14, they're explicitly called apostles together.
What was this?
During their first big missionary journey, they were taking the gospel into new territory, Cyprus, southern Galatia. And what's really interesting is that just before this, in Acts 13, they're listed among prophets and teachers. But then in the context of this pioneering work, they get designated as apostles. And it even mentions Barnabas first in that verse, Acts 14.14.
Okay, Barnabas and Paul. Who else? Apollos.
Apollos, yeah. The material points us to 1 Corinthians chapter 4, around verses 6 to 9. Paul's defending his own apostleship to the Corinthians, right? And he includes Apollos when he talks about us apostles.
Okay.
The context is clearly about the work he and Apollos did together establishing the church in Corinth. So the source says Apollos is clearly called an apostle in this pioneer sense there.
Makes sense. What about Silas and Timothy? They work closely with Paul too.
Them too. Look at 1 Thessalonians. Paul opens the letter, including Silvanus, that's Silas and Timothy. Then in chapter 2, verse 6, he refers to apostles of Christ. Our sources argue this must include all three of them.
In the context there.
Again, it's about their initial fruitful work bringing the gospel to Macedonia, planting that pioneer church in Thessalonica. It's tied to that groundbreaking effort.
So, okay, we have Barnabas, Apollos, Silas, Timothy alongside Paul. Does this mean anyone involved in evangelism or church planting back then got called an apostle?
No, and that's a really important distinction the material makes. It's clear that lots of people were involved, called fellow workers and other things. But the title apostle itself, it seems it was used sparingly.
Sparingly.
It was seen as a special title, not just thrown around casually. The implication seems to be it was applied to those whose calling, gifting, and actual, fruitfulness in pioneer work became clear and confirmed over time.
So it wasn't automatic.
Not at all. Our material even reminds us that Paul's own apostleship wasn't universally accepted. Some people in Corinth questioned him, remember, so recognition wasn't guaranteed, even for someone like Paul.
That's a really key nuance. It's about recognized effectiveness in breaking new ground, not just being part of the team.
Precisely. It wasn't just a job description, it was a recognized calling.
Okay. Let's touch on a few other references the material brings up. James, the brother of Jesus, he wasn't one of the 12 either.
Right. After James, the son of Zebedee, is killed, this James, Jesus' brother, becomes a major leader in the Jerusalem church. And Paul mentions him in 1 Corinthians 15 and Galatians 1 as being among the apostles.
So he's included somehow.
Seems so.
Yeah.
Even though not one of the originals, he's seen as having joined the ranks, focusing on holding ground and preaching the gospel among the Jews in Jerusalem.
And the false apostles we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, 2 Corinthians 11, Revelation 2. Our material basically says their existence confirms that apostle was understood as a wider category. You wouldn't need counterfeit versions if there wasn't a recognized, genuine article beyond just the 12.
Good point. What about Andronicus and Junias, Romans 16?
Yes, they're called outstanding among the apostles. Now, the sources note there's a bit of scholarly back and forth on what among the apostles means exactly.
How so?
Well, does it mean there were apostles themselves and really good ones? Or does it mean the existing apostles held them in high regard? Both readings are apparently possible based on the Greek.
Okay, and the source mentions Junias might be a woman's name.
Yes, that's another point of discussion. Scholars have debated whether Junias is masculine or feminine. The material just notes those different scholarly views.
Got it. And Epaphroditus, Philippians 2 calls him an apostolos.
Yes, but notice whose apostolos he is. Your messenger, Paul says to the Philippians. He's the apostolos and the Philippian church.
Ah, sent by them, not necessarily by Christ in the same way.
That's the distinction the material draws. While he joined Paul's team for a bit, he's probably not an apostle in the same sense as Barnabas or Silas, because the text specifies he's sent by the church.
Okay, similar then to those guys collecting money in 2 Corinthians 8.
Exactly the same principle. They're called apostoloi too, but specifically messengers or representatives of the churches, not of Christ. Our sources mention that many translations use messengers there to make that distinction clear.
Okay, wow. We've covered the words, the unique role of the 12, Paul is this sort of bridge figure, the evidence for these pioneer workers, and then these other tricky references. How does the material pull this all together? What's the synthesis? What is an apostle based on all this?
Well, it brings these threads together nicely. The core idea is, yes, the 12 had an absolutely unique, unrepeatable foundational role, but the term apostle was definitely used more broadly than just them. One scholar, the sources quote Kampenhausen, describes apostles outside the 12 primarily as foundation-laying preachers of the gospel, missionaries and church founders possessing the full authority of Christ. Part of a larger circle, but still focused on that foundational missionary work.
And what about the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia entry mentioned?
It suggests that the primary role for all apostles, including the 12, was actually the propagation of the gospel, spreading the message, though it still fully acknowledges the 12's unique foundational status.
So if you had to boil it down, the main New Testament meaning, especially when not talking about the 12, what is it?
The sources conclude it's really strongly tied to the pioneer work of taking the gospel to unreached peoples, resulting in new communities. That seems to be the core function.
So the material lands on church planting among unreached people groups as a pretty fair description.
Yes, that's the phrase used. A fair description of the New Testament concept of apostolic ministry in that broader sense.
This deep dive has definitely shown the term apostle was, well, richer and more layered in the New Testament than we sometimes assume. It clearly included the 12, who are utterly foundational.
Absolutely. Uniquely so.
But our material makes a strong case that it also extended to these key pioneer figures, missionaries, church planters, people sent out with Christ's authority to really break new ground.
Yeah, that idea of being commissioned and sent into new territory seems crucial, whether that was the whole known world, starting from Jerusalem for the 12, or specific unreached regions for Paul, Barnabas, Silas, and the others.
And as you noted right at the start, our sources acknowledge there are different views today on how this all applies now.
Yeah.
We've really just focused on unpacking what the New Testament itself seems to show, according to this material.
Exactly. Just exploring the texts and the analysis provided in the sources.
So maybe here's something to think about, something to take away from this. Given that the core idea of an apostle is being this sent one, commissioned for a task, often involving heading into new territory with authority, how does looking at this historical picture make you think about being sent in your own life, in your work, whatever field you're in? What might it mean for you to be a sent one right where you are?
That's a really interesting question to ponder, isn't it?